Okay, you are listening to the award-winning Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Philadelphia Budget Director Sabrina Maynard to discuss the recently passed fiscal year 2024 budget. And Councilmember Kendra Brooks will discuss her opinion regarding the budget and share with us her thoughts on the 2023 Spring Council session. So we'll open the show with our interview with Sabrina Maynard, Philadelphia City Budget Director. All right, Sabrina Maynard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we get into budget talk, you're new to the role. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you found yourself here?
Sure. So I've been with the city for about 8 years. I started with our Department of Human Services and a finance role. And then I actually was in the budget office previously for about 4 years during the first term. And then I was chief of staff to the finance director. And then I moved back to budget to be in this role. So I've been sort of in and around city finances for about 8 years, but I've been in this role for about 3 months. And it's been a crash course in everything that's changed since the last time I was in budget, like the pandemic.
I can imagine. What we'd like to do, for people who may not be familiar with it or who may not remember, can you walk us through the budget process a little bit and tell us sort of how this all comes together?
Sure. So we kind of joke here that the budget process never ends because we're always in an annual cycle. We have a fiscal year that begins on July 1st and ends on June 30th. And then throughout each year, we have milestones related to the next year. So we have just entered our fiscal year 2024. And what we are going to start planning for very soon is fiscal year 2025, which will start next July. And so what does that mean? So in this coming fall, we will issue what we call them budget calls that will go out to our operating departments that get operating funding and departments that get capital funding, asking them kind of what's going on, what has changed since the last time we connected, what are their needs in the upcoming years. We collect all that information. We do community engagement to collect feedback from the public about sort of what they think our priorities should look like. We review priorities with respect using a racial equity lens and kind of bring all of that together. And then we also work with an outside consultant to see like what our revenues are expected to look like for the next year. So a lot of this starts to come together in January and February of the year. So we're sort of gearing up in the fall, January and February, we're collating all this information. And then when we get a sense of what we think our revenues are going to look like in the coming year, we then figure out, okay, this is how much room we have to make new investments. And then we sort of start narrowing down what the priorities are with input from lots of different stakeholders, including the mayor, and sort of figure out like, what can we fund? What do we want to put in our proposed budget? The proposed budget comes out in early March. And so that's when the mayor gives the budget address, kind of laying out the priorities for the upcoming year. We release our information that we've been working on publicly, and that kicks off a process with City Council, whereby all city departments are brought in for budget hearings. And so council members will ask departments all kinds of questions related to their budgets, their operations, as we start to kind of talk about council's priorities as well as our priorities. And then at the end of that process, which usually concludes in May, the administration and council work together to come to an agreement on what should make it into the final budget. So the proposed budget is just that, it's proposed. It's our initial starting place. And then we work with City Council on a final document that council members are willing to agree to. And then we get that done sometime in June, and we're ready to go for the new fiscal year, which starts in July. And then we do it all over again. And so we're always thinking about whatever year number is after the year that we're in. So right now it's the calendar year 2023, it's fiscal year 2024, and we're starting to think about fiscal year 2025. So we're always in that cycle.
Hey, and one of the key things that we're always talking about on this show and is a major topic around the city's poverty. Can you give us an overview of how this budget approaches poverty and what are some of the things we can expect over the next year or so?
Yeah, when we think about poverty, and we get this question sometimes, like, what are our investments related to poverty? And I would say it's it's kind of everything. Every department thinks about the extent to which they interact with the city's need related to poverty. So we kind of chunk our different areas of spending into some high level categories, and all of them have sort of ties into a lot of this. And so our budget includes billions. It's about a $6 billion budget. It's got billions of dollars in operating funding for things like streets, filling potholes, and fire protection. We have high rates of fires. Our human services functions. These are just like basic ongoing functions that we perform from year to year. And so I don't want that to get lost when we talk about sort of new investments. But when we do new investments, we sort of think about them in a couple of different priority areas. And there are new investments in this budget in some of these in all these priority areas. So quality education for all. We've added funding for pre-K to add additional pre-K slots to get more children in early on into high quality education. We increase our school district contribution to make sure that the district has stable finances and is able to provide quality education to students. Adding staff and resources for community schools, adding funding for the community college, which includes our the Cato Scholarship Program, which is a tuition-free program for low-income students, which has been something we launched during the pandemic that has been a great way to get students who otherwise would not be able to go to school to get higher education for free with enhanced supports. Adding 6-day service at library sites, and adding internet accessibility for K through 12 families. And so those are all operating side investments related to education. We also focus on about a safer and more just Philadelphia. And so this is a lot of those anti-violence strategies that pop up a lot. And so investments in forensics and Operation Pinpoint, which is a police analytics program, anti-violence programs like our group violence intervention stipends, trauma supports for first responders, juvenile justice investments, so adding staff at our juvenile justice center, clearing criminal justice debts to make it easier for returning citizens to transition to a more stable economic situation, and then adding funding for public safety cameras. And then on the capital side, making investments in some facilities, adding funding for fire facilities, funding a new forensics lab for police, and then some kind of public safety, some basic public safety requirements or investments in the prisons. So roof repair, emergency power systems, and security. We also invest in inclusive growth and economic opportunity, kind of recognizing that we have to continue to figure out ways to get people on a pathway to economic stability. And so this gets into some of the tax cuts that were part of the budget, which I can talk a little bit more about on the wage tax side and on our BERT, which is our business tax. We make a large investment in SEPTA, which is the Public Transit Authority. It's like $110 million that goes to SEPTA from the city. We've also invested, and this is new in this budget, $31 million over 2 years, or in 24 and then again in 25 for low-income individuals to use SEPTA for free. So this is kind of a new innovative strategy to make it much easier for folks who have challenges paying for SEPTA, enabling them to use SEPTA so that they can go to work or school or whatever it is that they need to do. And then additional investments in community and economic development. So adding some staff in city planning, and then investing in diverse suppliers related to bipartisan infrastructure law work. We also like to invest in what we call thriving neighborhoods. So this includes investments in clean and safe streets, adding new illegal jumping crews, expanding street sweeping, and doing additional traffic calming work. Housing and shelter, so increasing, adding supportive housing units, tiny homes, encampment resolution, and expanding the right to counsel, making it easier for folks to get and maintain housing. And then climate change and resiliency, so expanded investments in the Environmental Justice Commission and adding additional positions in our Office of Sustainability to do sustainability work. And then one of the things that I think sometimes is maybe less exciting to the outside world, but is very exciting to those of us here, is sort of investments in core city functions to make sure that we're able to pay our employees and we're able to recruit and retain employees and make sure that we're able to deliver on all these city services. So we also make investments in internal functions to achieve our core priorities. And that includes our fiscal stability, which enables us to make all of these investments. So all these pieces are sort of tied together, and we see all of these as sort of interacting with poverty.
You mentioned the tax cuts, and I was wondering if you could just walk us through what you think the benefits of these tax cuts will be.
Yeah, so I think if you just look at fiscal year 2023 versus fiscal year 2024, the dollar amounts seem really small. But what we've been able to do over the last several decades is incremental changes that sum to something really meaningful. So one of the common critiques of the city is that we have a high wage tax rate and we have a high business tax rate. And so if you look back historically, as we've made incremental cuts over time, our resident wage tax rate is now the lowest it's been since the mid-1970s. And the business income and receipts tax on the net income side is the lowest it's been since the 1980s. So we've made, while year to year, the numbers look really small, if you kind of take it over time, we've made meaningful progress towards making sure that we have a more competitive tax system, which helps us all.
So when you look at, these reductions, they are small. This year, I think for the wage tax, the average Philadelphian, I think, is going to see $21 a year in savings. So but ultimately, I think it's something like $32 million in revenue that the city won't have. So how do you recoup that lost revenue?
Yeah, so we think of tax cuts as investments. And so when we do a budget, we look at what we're going to bring in revenue and we look at what we're going to bring in expenses, and those things have to be, or what we're going to spend out in expenses, and those things have to be in balance for our budget and 5-year plan to be approved by our oversight authority. And so when we look at something like tax cuts, we think of that as we're investing revenue we would have gotten otherwise into a new thing, because we see the value in making sure that we have a competitive tax structure so that businesses want to come here and stay here and provide family sustaining jobs for the people who live here. So it's taken as sort of part of the wide picture. And doing it incrementally over time means that when you make an investment, you're making an investment in tax relief, but you're also able to make investments in other things on an ongoing basis. So we're kind of chipping away over time at these various pieces.
Around this time of year, we get a surprising, consistent string of questions about the school income tax. And this is something that I don't think a lot of people know about. It's not the school tax that we pay through property, it's on unearned income. That rate also came down. But the issue there for me is, as I look at it, say, well, okay, that's on unearned income, dividends, that kind of thing. Why was it necessary to bring that down?
I think I would have to double check with some of the tax folks on this, but I think it's tied to some of the other rates. So it's not a separate piece that we cordon off. I think it's just as written in law, it's like a function of other rates that we have.
Okay. Yeah. When the pandemic came and happened, the city received about $1.4 billion in American Recovery Plan funds from the federal government. How much of that money do we still have?
Yeah, so we've spent basically what we've done. I'll just back up for a second. So $1.4 billion is a lot of money. And when you hear that, it's wow, the city got an infusion of dollars. But I will add, the city's losses were $1.5 billion. So basically, what ART meant for us is it was a lifeline. And it meant that we were able to avoid making sort of more catastrophic cuts that we otherwise would have had to make if we didn't have that lifeline. And so what we've done is it's very flexible federal money, and it has enabled us to do what's called revenue replacement, where basically, typically when you get a grant, it's for a very narrow purpose, and you have to spend the money in that very narrow purpose related to however the grantor defines what you can do. Under the ARP funds, if we're able to use it for revenue replacement, we could basically use it just as revenue. And so what we've done is built into our 5-year plan sort of chunks by year. And I can pull up the exact numbers, but that we have remaining. It's programmed through the end of calendar year 2024, which brings us into fiscal year 2025. And so we kind of chunked it out over time so that we didn't end up in that situation where one year we have a lot of money and the next year we don't have as much. And so this is sort of how it breaks out. So we've spent, I think we have about 800,000 left. So that's not 800,000, sorry, 800 million, 800 million, got my zeros off. So it's about just under 400 million in FY24, and then about 450 million in FY25. And so those are the remainders. And when we do a 5-year plan, which is what the city does, we don't look at our taxes and our spending in a single year. We kind of look at it over time. We make sure that any changes we're making maintain a balanced plan in the out years. So we're not making like short-sighted decisions that mean we're kind of using this one-time infusion for things that are going to be recurring, leaving us with a challenge on the back end. So we built it in over time. It's programmed through FY24 or FY25, and it's all kind of burdened off over time.
Now, when that plan was created, did the city expect to have the extra revenue that maybe they didn't expect to have in those years? So we're talking about, was it a $600 million surplus, something around that neighborhood? So how do those two things sort of fit together, the revenue surplus plus the American Recovery Plan funds?
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is our fund balance, which is sort of like, it's kind of like the amount left in your checking account after you've like been paid and paid your bills. And there were a couple of things that happened sort of one time in our previous fiscal year that it's how we ended up with a higher fund balance than we anticipated. And so that includes, we had like a banner year for realty transfer tax, for example. Like we had, there were a lot of real estate transactions that happened, and that's slowed afterwards. Our business income and receipts tax came in a little higher than anticipated, but that's sort of fallen off a little bit. So there were some one-time things that happened. And then on the spending side, one of the challenges the city has faced, and other cities have this challenge as well, is sort of around recruitment and retention. And so we actually have higher vacancies than we've had in like recent memory. And we've struggled to fill positions and to retain folks when they're here, which means that overall we're spending less on personnel. So kind of taking all those things together, that meant that we had a little bit more of a cushion ending in 22, which then carries over into 23.
Okay. I'd like to bring in Denise Clay-Murray here on Philadelphia Hall Monitor.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. I guess my first question for you regards the state budget and how it connects to the city budget. Right now, the state budget has technically been passed, but it's what's in a state known as an impasse right now, because the House and the Senate both have to sign off on it, and the Senate's not coming back until September. How does that affect the city budget, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think we get money through the state, so we're kind of keeping an eye on what that means for us. I mean, I think if there isn't a state budget, we have to figure out like what happens with state money that we expect to receive. And so I think it's sort of an open question. And then we're also looking to see sort of what, if any, new investments end up in the budget that would kind of trickle down to us. I think we're watching what's going on there. It's hard to say.
Okay, now you mentioned to us that there's 800 million in American Recovery Plan funds that are still available to the city. Is there do you all already have a plan for what you want to do with that money? Or is it possible to maybe put some more money into poverty reduction, or to put some more money into SEPTA out of that money?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we had a $1.5 billion revenue loss. And others, we were in a unique situation compared to other cities. When the pandemic hit, other cities that rely on sort of tax sources that are a little less volatile did not have the level of loss that we did. So the ARPA money for a lot of other places was sort of like, for lack of a better word, extra, like it was on top of what they otherwise would have had. For us, it meant that we were able to avoid worse cuts, not that we have like additional revenue available for things. And so what we've done is program it into our plan to make sure that we're able to avoid making additional cuts. And we see all of our operations and the investments I talked about earlier is being very closely tied to poverty investments. And by kind of programming it over time, it's all accounted for. It's not like there's 800 million like left available. It's like it's the core of, or it's part of, it's central to our FY24 budget and our FY25 budget. So it's helping fund kind of core city operations. So
Okay.
it's not extra, unfortunately. That would be a great challenge for us to have if we were in a situation that was sort of similar to other cities, but we're unique in that regard.
Now, this is the last budget that Mayor Kenny is doing in his final term. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like, knowing that this was the last budget? Was it, what was there a sense of urgency to get certain things put into it, in terms of like legacy building, or was this just another day at the office?
Yeah, I think in many ways it was sort of the culmination of a lot of work in the past, kind of building on what we've prioritized. And I think that kind of the central to that is like all the education focus that has happened over the last 8 years, almost 8 years. And so that's reflected in continued investments in pre-K and community schools, and continuing to make sure that rebuild is on a good path so that we can invest in our parks and recreation and free library facilities. We also increased our investment to the school district and our investment in the Community College of Philadelphia to make sure that students are able to attend there for free and get additional supports, in addition to just, we give them operating money as well. So it's kind of general operating dollars. So I think it's a kind of coalescence of those various pieces. And I'll say the other kind of new thing that happened this past cycle is better integration of community engagement and collecting community priorities, and then clearly tying our investments to what we heard from community members. This is maybe not the best place to share a PowerPoint presentation, but we put something together that basically shows like we're investing in, for example, community college. And that item is like a priority for different people. So we flagged it as a racial equity priority. So like through our racial equity engagement, folks identified that as something that was really critical. And then we also heard in community sessions that the community also feels very strongly that this is an important investment for us to make. So we've tried to sort of bring together, not just making investments because we think they're a good idea, but making sure that it's reflective of all this community engagement and racial equity work that the administration has built on over the last couple of years. And so it's kind of a culmination of all of that.
Okay, so my final question for you. This is the mayor's last budget, which means there's going to be a new mayor coming in. Did the administration sit down with the candidates that are running for this office to kind of give them an understanding of what they'll be left with financially should they win? And did anyone run from the room screaming?
So to put a plug in, we actually have like the highest credit ratings we've had in quite a while. We have a balanced 5-year plan with our reserves. We are in a good position in fund balance over the next couple of years. So we're in a solid place, I think, barring new surprises, which are always a challenge. In terms of meeting with the candidates, we have a transition committee a transition coordinator run through the mayor's office who coordinates all of that work. And so I think probably conversations in the future, but no, they're not part of the budget process this year.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll return you to Larry McGlynn, and you're still listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
Right, thank you, Denise. Ms. Maynard, the last thing I want to ask you, long term, how would you describe the fiscal health of the city?
I'd say, I think we've all been burned by the last couple of years. We've really had a rough go of it. I think, the 2008 recession took a really long time to get out of. And I think in my first tour of duty in budget during the first term, I think we were still sort of in some ways dealing with some of the after effects of that. I'd say now, the American Rescue Plan has been a massive lifeline for us and really helped us to avoid some of the devastating cuts that are harder to come back from than you might think, because when you take away a unit, you have to rebuild that unit. It's not just the same as like took dollars away, we put them back. There's really a rebuilding process that happens. So I think we're in a position, we're making contributions to our budget stabilization reserve, kind of on an ongoing basis for first time. So over the last couple of years. So I think we're in a place where I could say cautiously optimistic.
All right.
People keep talking about a recession. Don't know when that's going to happen. So
nobody does.
Nobody does.
Sabrina Maynard, new city budget director. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.
All right. We'd like to thank new Philadelphia City Budget Director Sabrina Maynard for joining us on the show. And I'd like to introduce Denise Clay Murray. Hi, Denise. Oh, you're muted.
See, I've been for all these years, for all this time, I don't remember to always unmute myself.
Well, you know that it's never going to end. We're always going to be muting, unmuting. That's just how it is. So, how are you doing today, Denise?
I'm good. I'm sorry that I'm late. Unfortunately, I got stuck in Beyonce traffic on my way back home from the roundtable held by the folks in the City Council Special Committee on Gun Violence. And if you're going north on 95 to Philadelphia from like Chester or Delaware right now, I hope you have a good book.
Yeah. Well, whenever there's a big event like this, yeah, you're going to see traffic woes. And but we're glad you're safe and home. Mm-hmm. And what we're going to do, we're going to talk about that roundtable in a little bit. Mm-hmm. But first, we're going to play an interview we did with Councilmember Kendra Brooks. And I'm glad we played the Sabrina Maynard interview first because she talks about the budget, explains some of the things that they did and why they did it. And now you're going to hear, amongst other things we discussed with Councilmember Brooks, you know, she'll discuss her thoughts on the budget a little bit to maybe give you a slightly different view based on some of the things that she thought.
But that said, I have to admire Ms. Maynard because I don't know if I could come into a situation where we're 3 months into my employ, I'm handed the city budget to put together. I don't know if I could have done that.
No. She, you know, that's a very hard thing to do, and she explained it very well. Mm-hmm. You know, she explained it, and you know, we always had Marissa Waxman on the show to talk about budget, and she took a job with the Treasury Department. Marissa was excellent at breaking things down and explaining how it works, and I thought Sabrina Maynard did just as good a job. You know, so I'm very glad that she was with us and that she'll be with us in the future to talk more about these things. So we're very lucky and very glad she was able to do that. So here is our interview with Councilmember Kendra Brooks. All right, Councilmember Kendra Brooks, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Philadelphia just approved the fiscal year 2024 budget. Can you give us your thoughts on that final document?
I was very excited about the budget wins. You know, I think we were able to secure $3 million for crisis response teams, which is huge. It's something we started early on, and they have been gearing up, and we were able to give them additional money to expand the program. The $800K towards the Office of Worker Protections. You know, I've done so many things around labor rights, and it was important for us to keep those things moving and make sure the things that we have created are able to work, right? It's one thing to pass laws and put things on the books for policies, but if we don't have the proper staffing to move it forward, it's useless. So I was really excited about that. The other one of my specific requests was $100K for Sickle Cell Foundation. That's a family. Many people in my family have sickle cell or have died from sickle cell. So there's something huge for me, which was important. And the other one was Pennsylvania Immigration Family Unity Project. So I remember I got a phone call from a friend about Christian, someone who was going through immigration issues. The funny thing about the phone call, it was a friend from New York that reached out to me because Christian was his neighbor, and wanted to know, is anything I can do to support? This was a few months ago. So these are all things that were very important to me. And those are things, some of the things that I specifically asked for in this year's budget. And then some of my colleagues asked for so much more out of school time programming and all those things. So I also helped co-sponsor some of the other acts. So I'm really excited about the things we were able to win in the budget, and there are some things I wish we could have gotten more. Yeah, I really would like more. But one of the things I learned early on is when I start asking for things, the first question I get is, how are we going to pay for it? And I wasn't willing to pay for it off the backs of working people.
So one of the things that you mentioned, I think right at the beginning, were the crisis management teams. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that works?
Yeah, so the crisis response team is a way that a mental health provider is able to respond to mental health crises throughout the city. We started with, I think, a unit in West Philadelphia and looking to continue to expand that particular services. So a mental health provider will go out within, I think the goal was 3 hours to respond to a mental health crisis instead of a police officer. And we were looking to expand more of that throughout the city, because a lot of things people are calling 911 for are really mental health crises and not necessarily cause for the police. So we thought by doing this, or we believe, or statistics show, that when police are able to respond to police-related issues, mental health responders are able to respond to mental health-related issues, the results are better.
Okay. So one of the contentious aspects of this budget cycle was the tax reductions. Wage tax, birth tax came down. What are your thoughts on that? And then how does the city recoup that lost revenue?
Well, I voted no on the tax cuts because I believe there's so much more that we can do with our budget surplus than cut taxes. When I think about the things that I would love to see, it's about reducing gun violence and cleaner streets and, more greening and cleaning. And those are the things that are most important to me. So the investments that I felt needed to be made were into city services, not to cutting taxes, which, everyone has a different thought on how that happens. But what we realize, a lot of these tax cuts benefit mega organizations, not necessarily our mom and pop. And I think the group Coalition for Inclusive Growth, which puts this tax, they also said that, the top 3 priorities for small businesses are cleaner streets and programming for youth. So we need to make sure that those are the things that we're funding. So it's like some contradictions in why, people ask for the tax cuts. But ultimately, I could not vote on the tax cuts. That's why my budget asks were limited, because I wanted to make sure that, one of the first things I learned in council when I started asking for things, they said, how are we going to pay for it? And I don't think that tax cuts is going to get us to where we want to be.
So I'm going to ask you the really hard and possibly unfair question right now. Philadelphia is the fourth big city in America. It's also one of the wealthiest cities in America. How do we begin to create that more equitable Philadelphia? And can that type of change really be accomplished on a local level?
I do believe that. I think these investments that I talk about, when we're talking about investments in the young people are our future. They're going to drive our workforce development. We need to focus on workforce development, and not just for young people. We have folks that are in need of changing careers. We have formerly incarcerated folks that are coming home. We have folks that just need a second wind in life. And if we don't have the proper job training and workforce development programs to move it forward, that continues to perpetuate this cycle of poverty. And I think those are the investments that we need to make, and they have to be realistic. I think a lot of times, people say, oh, jobs, jobs, jobs. It has to be more than just creating a job. Folks need good pay with benefits in order to pull out of the cycle of poverty. Any old job won't do. So a lot of my pushback when people say, oh, this particular thing is going to bring more jobs. Well, if we're talking $7.25 an hour, that's not going to help our poverty situation. It's just going to give someone something to do during the day. Because it's $7.25. I don't even think you can get a Happy Meal at McDonald's for that. So you have to work a whole hour. Suppose you're a family of 3, so half of your first day of work to go to treat your family out to dinner. And McDonald's is not actually the best place, to talk about where we're going to dinner as a family either. But that was just a perfect example of when I think about fast food and children. We need to make sure that when we're talking about the investments that we're making into our city, they're sustainable and realistic. And realistic is that if we're talking about creating jobs, they need to be good paying quality jobs, preferably union with benefits, because that's how you're going to end the cycle of poverty, not with more 7.25, 20-hour a week jobs floating around the city that we want adults to sustain families off of. And, I'm going to hold true to that. And I think that's where we'll see our real investments. People want to say that I'm anti-growth. I'm not against growth, but growth for whom? If it's not growth for my neighbors or my children and their friends that are coming out of high school that may not decide to go into college and their only options are low-wage jobs, that's unacceptable. We have to provide people with a sustainable living and living wages in order for them to grow and for our city to grow. And until we do that, we're going to continue this perpetual cycle of poverty that we see in the city. And those are the things that I'm not going to support across the board, because I have to look at these people every day when I go home. I still live in the neighborhood that I grew up in, which is low income to moderate income, and some of my neighbors work 2 and 3 jobs just to make rent on my block, and yeah, the narrative that, poor people are lazy is a lie. The fact is we just need to pay people a living wage so people's quality of life is better, and people are able to sustain and take care of their families.
Yeah, no, the myth that poor people are lazy, it never made any sense, because they're the people who are doing the most work.
The hardest work.
The hardest, yeah.
Labor intensive.
Yeah, it makes no sense. Okay, I'd like to bring in Denise Clay Murray here on Philadelphia Home Monitor.
Thank you for joining us, council member. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you are one of the minority members of council as a member of the Working Families Party. You all had a really big splash the last electoral cycle when you took one of the seats that had traditionally been designated for Republicans on council at large. I understand that Nicholas O'Rourke, who was your running mate last time around, is also running this time around. Could this be the year that the Working Families Party picks off both at-large seats in council?
Well, that's the year that we're hoping for. I think with a vacant seat, the work that Nicholas O'Rourke has done, and the fact that I was able to prove that a third-party candidate can really bring change in the city for working people, is going to be our catalyst to kind of take us over the peak next time. And I'm really hoping, and anticipating Nicholas being able to win on November 7th, and we come into city council together, 2 minority party seats that are held by Working Families Party candidates or elected to that point.
Okay. Now, in terms of some of the things you were talking about in terms of, poverty and how do we get out of poverty, about creating good paying jobs, not just jobs for the sake of jobs. Right now in Harrisburg, the House of Representatives passed a bill that would increase the minimum wage to $15. Now, I'm from New Jersey. It's been 15 in Jersey for a minute, which is why everyone in Pennsylvania, which is why when you go to New Jersey, you see so many Pennsylvania license plates in the parking lot, because that's where everybody's going to work. Do you, when you hear some of the objections of the Chamber of Commerce to this, do you ever want to just sit them down and explain, no, I don't think that this financial calamity that you're predicting is what's going to happen here?
Well, I always feel like I want to push back against that, but people have their talking points and have to run with it. But in reality, $15 is still not enough. We've been fighting for $15 an hour for 10 years. At this point, people need far more than that in order to survive. But the reality, moving to 15, we'll be able to see significant change. And then I was like, what about the folks who already make 15? Well, that means they need to and deserve to be making far more than that as well. And I think we have to continue to push for that. My favorite story to tell is when I had my daughter as a teenager. I worked at the nursing home. I was $11.99 C member, and the minimum wage back then, I think, was like $6.80 or maybe $4.85 maybe. Because just recently I found an old pay stub, right? My daughter is 32 years old. Minimum wage has only risen by what? That's $3, which is ridiculous. However, the cost of living, the average house on my block went from rent from $350 to $1,500. Yeah, ponder that. How do you expect people to live? It's virtually impossible if we aren't raising wages with inflation in the state, and even more so just anywhere. Like $15 is barely enough still. And I'm glad that we're making, waves towards that. But by the time we catch up with the rest of the world, we're still behind.
Now, in terms of this year's budget, another thing that was addressed at least somewhat was the affordable housing issue. You have been working on the issue of rent control, trying to get at least rent control heard as a possible concept here in the city. Where does that stand right now? And what can people do to kind of move the needle?
I mean, we have to continue to push the conversation. I think for me, I felt like as soon as I started mentioning and pushing for rent control, we had far more conversations about low income affordable housing. So it's our job to continue to push the envelope until we get a win. And the win is rent control and affordable accessible housing. And when I think of affordable housing, I'm talking about less than 30% AMI. Everyone wants to talk about affordability at 50% and above, but some people that work for the city don't make 50% above AMI. So we have to continue to move this forward. People can say I'm on my soapbox about it, but we have to continue this conversation until we really have affordable housing in the city. Because wages and housing affordability are things that continue the cycle of poverty. People can't even be house rich. Right? People can't even afford to purchase a house in the city at this time. The average working person is not within the income bracket to buy a house in even a low income neighborhood. When I think about, once again, I'm talking about in my neighborhood, and we were looking at housing stats because one of my sisters is looking in houses without need for severe repair, starting at $150,000. Right. And the ones that they won't show you pictures of the inside of the house are the ones that are less than $150,000. How is a working family supposed to ever be able to build generational wealth by purchasing homes if housing affordability is something is out the door when we don't have proper income, and so many other variables that are preventing that for home ownership, and it also keeps rent very high.
Now, a lot of this stuff it ends up coming from the top down. It has to be a priority in the mayor's office before it becomes a priority anywhere else. You went through the mayoral primary. You saw, who came out of it. It wasn't necessarily the candidate you endorsed. Are you optimistic that no matter who becomes mayor next, we can actually have these conversations and maybe, come to a little bit of understanding of, no, you cannot flip burgers for $7.25 an hour and be able to afford a $150,000 house that you still have to put $2,000 or $3,000 more dollars into to make it livable?
I feel that we have an opportunity to kind of build this ship together. I feel that, one thing I have been tagged to be since I've been elected, even though I'm an activist, is to be a consensus builder. And I believe that we can bring everyone to the table to figure out what needs to happen, and also advocate for the things that are very important to me and my constituents. And I believe that that is my role, and that's what people elect me to do, to continue to push the envelope on things. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I realize that nothing I've done since I've been in council has been easy. And I'm looking forward to us working together to build the city that, that we advocate for working families.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, my co-host, and you are still listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
All right. Thank you, Denise. And Councilmember, before we let you go, there's a little bit of a misconception about what City Council does during the summer. The belief is that, well, council's out, they're not having sessions, so they're at their beach. And we know that's not true. What are you in your office working on this summer?
So this summer, we're actually doing a lot of planning for some of our events that are coming. We have like an October event that we're planning hard for. This is when we do our planning. And we have a lot of meetings. Most of my summer is filled with like visiting government and nonprofit entities that we want to continue to expand and grow. I spend a lot of time meeting with my colleagues in both the state and the city around planning for legislation that we want to move when legislation is in play, when we're back in session. And my team spends a lot of time planning with other teams the things that need to get done in the fall. So no one is sitting back at the beach. This is sometimes, and reading. This is how we catch up with our reading time as well. So this is what we do over the summer. I wish it was all fun and games, but I did go on vacation for a week, but I'm back.
And everybody's entitled to that, at least.
Yeah, exactly. Just a week so far.
Well, Councilmember Kendra Brooks, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for having me. You guys have a great day.
You too. All right, we'd like to thank Councilmember Kendra Brooks for joining us here on the show, and especially sharing her view of the budget. I think it's really important to hear, you have the administration saying this is why we did what we did, and then you have somebody on council come in and say, well, here's another way to look at it and why I disagreed with some of it. And I think it's good to have that kind of discussion.
And if you listen to the council at large hearings or some of the other hearings that went on connected to the budget, you kind of knew that both she and Jamie Gaudier had their issues with this budget, particularly when it came to the tax cuts. It's going to be interesting. I'm looking at two different things when it comes to this. I'm looking at, one, what ultimately happens with the budget when the new administration comes in, because if this is at all like administrations past, sometimes people aren't as honest as they say they're going to be about what kind of fiscal shape they're leaving for the next person. So I'm interested in seeing that and how the tax cuts impact it. And I'm also especially interested in seeing what happens with the budget process if we do indeed get two minority members of council that are from the Working Families Party. I think it's going to change the budget process a lot, because Kendra Brooks and Jamie Gaudier fighting by themselves is one thing. Having someone else to help them out with that kind of makes it so they have to be listened to. And while you can override anything with 12 votes, you have to get 9 votes to get anything passed. And if you talk to enough people long enough, you can possibly sway some folks that may not have thought they were going to be swayed into coming around to your way of thinking. So I'm interested in seeing what happens with that as with the next budget process.
And I agree with you 100%. And speaking of city council, Denise, you visited city council today for a very interesting event. What was going on?
It was a round table. And they were literally sitting at the round table that is in the city council caucus room, which, by the way, is the absolute worst acoustical space in the entire city, bar none.
The echo in the room is very challenging. Yeah.
Yes. And that made it kind of hard to hear what the people gathered in that room were saying at times, but what they were saying was important because it was a special meeting of the Special Committee on Gun Violence. It was not a hearing, meaning that there were no votes taken, there was no legislation on the docket. But what it was something that Council Member Kenyatta Johnson, who's the chair of that committee, put together to try to bring everybody all the stakeholders who are involved in the gun violence issue here in Philadelphia, give them a chance to get together and talk about what they're doing this summer to try and keep the rate of gun violence down. If you've ever seen the movie Do the Right Thing, the Spike Lee classic, it's set on a very, very hot day in the summertime in Brooklyn. And why everything gets so violent and in some cases literally inflammatory in that movie is because he makes people cranky. And because he makes people cranky, sometimes that crankiness manifests itself in ways that leads to people, shooting other people. And if you've been here in Philly for a while, you've seen that in the summer, while in the wintertime, you may still have gun violence issues and shootings and stuff. In the summertime, that goes up. People are outside more. It's hot. People may not have enough to do. So Councilman Johnson brought in all of the people or just a selection of people. Some of their representatives, some of the people themselves didn't actually come. Like, for example, Commissioner Danielle Outlaw wasn't there, but she sent the first deputy of the department, which is basically her right-hand person. The folks from, some of the folks from the mayor's office couldn't make it, but they sent, high-ranking deputies to, be a part of the conversation. And what the conversation was basically, what are you going to do this summer to try to keep gun violence down? And what have you been doing throughout the last few months to prepare for this point? And probably the thing that stuck out most to me, well, two things that stuck out most to me. One, this is the first time I had ever been to a special committee on gun violence hearing in which the Sheriff Rochelle Bilal, was also a participant. Now, I know that the Sheriff's Department handles stuff like getting guns off the street and they work with the police to deal with illegal guns, but very rarely do you see Rochelle Bilal, the sheriff, in a discussion where they're talking about, okay, this is what we're going to do. And even she herself brought that up, saying, she thanked Councilman Johnson for inviting her because, as she put it, people like to put the sheriff in a box and they don't think that we do anything when it comes to gun violence, and we do. And I wanted to be here to make sure people knew that. And also, Larry Krasner was there, the district attorney. He came himself with several of his deputies. And it was really an interesting conversation because they talked about not only what was going right, which is that gun violence is going down and that we're not having as many murders as we did last year, but also how much further they still have to go, because while gun violence is going down, there is still this perception here in the city that we're not safe. And a lot of the discussion was on how to get what they're seeing in the numbers and what the public is seeing in terms of perception to match.
Now, part of me thinks if we're just having this discussion now, it's already too late. And I know that's not the case, right?
Well, you're not wrong necessarily.
Right. But I know that, the discussions about how are we handling the summer have been going on for a while now. But I think one of the catalysts maybe for this meeting, and tell me if this came up, is the mass shooting that happened the other week.
Well, my sources are telling me that played a little bit of a part in it. There's this sign that I saw in an office building once, and it said, "Jesus is coming, look busy." And while there were some, really legitimate things that came up and, discussions that were had and things that needed to be talked about, a lot of this felt very Jesus is coming, look busy to me, because it was something that probably would not have happened or not have happened this as quickly were it not for what happened in King's Essing. And also, the co-chair of the Special Committee on Gun Violence, Curtis Jones, he was there for a hot minute and talked about the summit that he wants to have. If you watched City Council their last meeting, a resolution was passed to have a gun violence summit that will discuss the various things that people need to do to combat gun violence. In one of my more recent columns in the newsletter, I talked about how the word summit makes my teeth hurt because it's usually not followed by anything. But the summit, from what I'm hearing, is scheduled for September 29th. So if it does happen on that date, we'll have that for you. But again, the word summit makes my teeth hurt. So, and actually, so do things like this a little. But, you kind of can't not get people into a room and meet after you have a mass shooting like that.
Well, what I keep coming back to, and this is just me editorializing a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
but when I hear these things, I hear, okay, summit, meeting today.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between anything that happened today and anything we would have heard 2 years ago or 3 years ago? I don't know that do we ever hear anything new out of these meetings?
Actually, to be fair, this time I did hear something new. And that something new is that folks are looking at how behind Philadelphia is in terms of the technology needed to solve crimes quickly. Larry Krasner in particular talked about how, in terms of forensic equipment and DNA testing and all the things that you need to do to not only know who committed the crime, but to be able to prove it in court, Philadelphia is about 10 years behind. Fortunately, as part of this year's budget, City Council appropriated money to start creating a new forensics lab that would start to take care of some of this problem. Because as DA Krasner put it, people know exactly who's been doing the shootings. They know who the shooter was. They know that they did it. But if you can't prove it in court and you can't prove it well enough to get an indictment, then you just know it, and it's of no use. And the way that you get it to go from being of no use to being something you can use is by having the technology necessary to make sure that you can do DNA testing, that you can collect forensic evidence and get it processed correctly. Even Sheriff Bilal was talking about how she needs an upgrade on her technology that will allow her to better track fugitives and get them off the street. So that was one of the better things that came out of this. But you're right, Larry. Sometimes folks are repeating themselves.
Yeah. Well, Denise, thank you so much for attending that hearing and hearing what they had to say. And thank you, as always, for being there when we interviewed Councilmember Brooks and Sabrina Maynard. We'd like to thank them for joining us. Next week on the show, somebody who you may know, Denise, Chris Murray, will be with us. And,
yes, we've met.
Yeah. And I will all see you next week on Hall Monitor. Have a good week.